Thank you. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our May 3rd session of the Hepatitis VLC, implementing negative and undetectable HBV DNA and HCV RNA lab reporting, made possible in partnership with the CDC Division of Viral Hepatitis. My name is Zakia Grubbs, and I'm a manager on the hepatitis team here at NASTAD. And joining us today are our presenter, Shauna Onofrey, Senior Epidemiologist in the Office of Research and Evaluation at the Massachusetts Department of Public Health and a member of NASDAQ's HepTAC Advisory Committee, and our moderator, Dan Church, Epidemiologist, Division of Epidemiology, Bureau of Infectious Disease and Laboratory Sciences with the Massachusetts Department of Public Health, and Chairperson of the CSTE Viral Hepatitis Subcommittee. The format for today's session is as follows. We will begin with a presentation by Shauna, followed by moderated discussion led by Dan. Feel free to use the chat to introduce yourselves and your jurisdictions and to put any of your questions. On May 17th, we will be meeting at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, where we will consider our conversation in the form of office hours with today's presenters. We hope to get into the nitty-gritty and ask questions and have a more candid conversation. So hopefully you all will be able to join us. Yeah, that's what I said. Before I hand it over to Shauna, I have a quick poll for you all. Can y'all see that? Yep, somebody can. I'll give it a few more seconds. All right. All right, I'll hand it over to you, Shauna.
Great, thank you. This is actually really helpful for me and for us in terms of thinking about where folks kind of might be coming to this conversation from. And I'm not surprised by the results, right? Like, I mean, I think we were just talking before the presentation that, as always, viral hepatitis has this really broad array of kind of where people are in terms of surveillance. And so this is very helpful. But I'm glad to see that actually quite a few more jurisdictions have negative HCV RNA reporting than have in the past. So, okay, can we pull my slides up, or do you need me to do that? Oh, my colors didn't come through, so it's going to be a very black and white slide, but that's okay, same information. So thank you for having me. Thank you for coming today. My name is Shauna Onofrey. I am on as a HepTAC consultant, but I also, for some large number of years, I can try and do the math in my head quickly. I was also the viral hepatitis surveillance coordinator for Massachusetts, and worked very closely with Dan Church, who will be the moderator today. And so the presentation I'm going to go through today is about capturing negative test results for viral hepatitis, which is why we're all here. No, can I advance these, okay, or should I just say next slide? Next slide, it is. So I wanted to do just kind of a quick overview of why are we talking about this in the first place, right? And I think everybody on this call probably knows this, that traditional infectious disease surveillance looks for the presence of disease entities, to be them bacteria or viruses, as in this case. And that's true for viral hepatitis too, but as treatable viruses that can cause both acute and chronic illness, negative testing can provide really valuable information about disease stage and continuum of care, and can be used to better triage limited staff and services, which unfortunately we all continue to deal with, especially I think now as folks are kind of getting back to whatever the new normal is in your jurisdiction. Next slide. But this question of how we convince folks that these are data that need to be captured seems to be a constant. So this is a question that had come up to HepTAC. Somebody was looking for some technical assistance on expanding reporting to include new negatives. And when I saw it come up, it felt a little like deja vu, because this is a question that we've been wrestling with for quite some time. I went back and looked, and HepTAC and its kind of initial iteration had pulled together some resources on this. And one of the things we had pulled was a presentation that had happened back in 2017. So this is like not a new question. It's just that I think folks are at different points within with how to wrestle with this. So as seen in the poll, more jurisdictions are capturing negative HCV RNA, which I feel like is maybe a little bit of an easier lift, and we'll talk a little bit about why, but certainly not all of you on the call today. And usually kind of the answer to how to get this approved is the same, right? We need a convincing argument. A financial economic argument is really helpful. And then we need a grasp of the technical requirements for implementation. And if possible, what this anticipated volume is. Like what is the, what's the real world implications of bringing on any new testing? Next slide. And certainly we've all had a major test of our surveillance systems, right, with COVID, which can be seen, I think, in both a positive and negative light. For a lot of places, this was proof that they could collect negative test results. But I think a lot of folks are also wrestling with the fact that COVID nearly crashed their systems because the volume was so high, even the positives, let alone negatives. Capturing negative results for HCV and hepatitis B tests will never be the same volume that COVID was, but I think I think everybody's got a little bit of PTSD from COVID. So even recognizing that, right? Now's a great time to be thinking about asking about negative reports because of this. Even if there's been recognition that your surveillance system maybe couldn't handle the volume, some places may be thinking about, well, what does that mean? What changes does that need to mean for our surveillance system? And now may be the time to build some changes in that would allow you to handle some of these negative results. And you can also, point to this test case of COVID that the system was able to, in some way, handle this, and was also able to figure out some things about how do we want to handle these kind of results. Next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit about what the resources that I'm trying to create for folks, but in general, I would say, and I can certainly include these on a tip sheet, but just to put them kind of out there, whenever we talk about bringing on these negative results, we're talking about requiring electronic reporting only. If you're in a place where you're accepting paper, I think avoiding any increase in paper processing is always the best way to do this. And ideally, if you're working with electronic lab reporting, this should be a minor coding change for most reporting entities. So where we get the argument that, oh, any change is going to be a significant burden on reporters, that's not necessarily the case if you've got electronic laboratory reporting. However, that will need to be monitored, right? Even if you're making a simple code shift, if you've got people who've been reporting the same test results all the time, making those code shifts, making sure that everybody makes those code shifts is really important. I will say within that, an all or nothing approach is usually easier for reporters than age-specific requirements. I know this is something that we had been talking about a couple of years ago in Massachusetts with, can we make the argument for just getting negatives for a certain age group? And what we usually hear from reporters is that it's easier to either just send everything to us or not send anything to us. I cannot state enough how important it is anytime you make any sort of change to your surveillance system to do any sort of test coding that you can ahead of time, and carefully consider things like how you define negatives, which we'll talk about with these tip sheets. Storage plans, what this is going to mean for the amount of storage that you have for electronic labs, how long you're going to store test results, the impact on deduplication, and what you're going to do with folks who don't match, which we could talk a little bit more about with this presentation too. And then always how you're going to use the data you collect, because I think if you don't have a really clear plan on how you're going to utilize this data, it doesn't make sense to start collecting it. If you're just trying to deal with the positives you have coming in, and you don't have a plan to like use this data to maybe try and lessen some burden or something like that, then hold off. Next slide. So the idea that we had with HepTAC was to create 3 tip sheets to talk about I guess the basics of how to collect some of these negative reports. So each tip sheet would include a justification, which I'll talk a little bit about in the upcoming slides, some technical considerations for data capture. And so that's some of the things like I'm talking about, like how you're defining negative for like a numeric result that's like less than 30 or something like that. Any notes on interpretation, how data maybe is managed in other jurisdictions, including things like the use of a black box. And we'll talk about that when we get to antibodies. And then some sample language for reporting requirements from jurisdictions with established reporting. I had wanted to have at least one of these tip sheets kind of fully completed before we got to this presentation. That did not happen, in part because I got to a point where I wanted to really hear from folks who would be trying to utilize this resource. if there was additional information that they would need. I certainly don't want to be putting anything out that's like, yeah, Shauna, we know all of this already. I want to make sure that it has information that's actually something you can utilize. And I also don't want it to be like anything that would be beyond what folks need. So, the hope is to kind of see how this discussion goes and really hear from you all about what's the information that you're really missing that would help you push this forward. Next slide. Oh, no, we're on the next slide. So in terms of thinking about the justification, I think many of you know all of this already or have thought through all of this already, but thinking about negative HCV RNA, this is the negative reporting I think has been required in some jurisdictions the longest, in part because it's not typically a screening test. Negative should, and I put should always in quotes because it's such a dangerous word sometimes, only be available on somebody who is screened positive at some point for a hepatitis C antibody. But it's incredibly powerful in determining if a case is currently infected. And the argument can be made more easily, I think, that allows you to direct limited resources in an easier way, which is why I think a lot of jurisdictions have managed to take this on. It's also useful in evaluating the uptake of testing recommendations and in monitoring care cascade, long-term outcomes, treatment uptake, and potentially reinfection. Next slide. With hepatitis C antibody, this is where we start getting into a question of a black box or a gray box, which is some sort of separate entity for holding these results, with the idea being that that there's not necessarily a reason for us to have person-specific test results on somebody who's tested negative. But a black box or a gray box is something that allows a system to query so that you could find out information about seroconversion and potentially get some information on testing volume, which is also, I think, really helpful, especially if you can get some limited information on testing by different demographic information. I will say that it appears to me that jurisdictions with kind of homegrown surveillance systems have been a little bit more successful in pushing this forward, in part because I think they've had a little bit more flexibility in creating a black box or gray box. That being said, I don't think it's impossible for other jurisdictions to do this as well. Next slide. Oh, and this slide didn't come across. It's okay. I think maybe I sent you the wrong version of this slide set. I apologize. So I'll just talk through this. Apologize to the group I'll make sure that the updated slides get sent at the end of the presentation. But similar to the negative RNA, hepatitis B DNA, what we're really looking at here is a test that gives us some idea of perhaps what stage folks are in terms of their infection. So it's going to be really helpful in determining, similarly, a care cascade for hepatitis B and looking at specific subpopulations in terms of perhaps where they are in the course of infection. I will say that this is a test that I personally have not thought as much about, but I think from some of the work that's being done around hepatitis B case definition, it may be really important in the next, currently and in the next couple of years in terms of how we move hepatitis B forward. Next slide. So I wanted to talk, one of the things I really wanted to talk about and that I kind of wrestled with in thinking about how we might create these tip sheets is the actual process for changing reporting requirements, and just a recognition that this can differ really significantly from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. I know a lot of jurisdictions have a process that's kind of more internal to the health department that probably doesn't look exactly the same, but that usually requires some approval of their state epi or their health commissioner. There may be a rolling annual or biannual process for updating regulations, and then there may be a review with something like an internal health council. And I think when it's a more of an internal process, that maybe this is not a lighter lift, but a little bit more of a straightforward process for some folks. And what I'd love to hear from is jurisdictions where their process for changing reporting requirements really differs from that. And if there's a special information that that folks need to help with that process. Next slide. So that's really kind of a very broad overview of what we're thinking about in terms of these tip sheets. And Dan and I will have a little bit of a conversation about negative reporting in general and some of the challenges with that. But what I really want today is to hear from all of you about what information is it that you need to kind of move this, especially those of you who answered on the poll that you're considering making these reportable in the near future. What's the barriers for you right now? What's the information that you feel like if you could point to, you know, that X number of jurisdictions already have this reportable, or that it's really useful for this particular thing, or that it ties to money, you know, because I know that that often is something that helps move things along. What's the information that you really need that would be most helpful in getting you to the next step with this process?
So if people want to put any comments or questions into the chat, I'm happy to bring this up, or you can certainly raise your hand and say it out loud. To get people thinking, I have a few questions that came up from the information you just shared, Shauna, and maybe you could talk about this. You talked about the need to monitor the negative test electronic reporting, and I think that's a really important point. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk about that a little bit more, just like how often should people be prepared to monitor, and what does that look like? What are some of the best methods?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, Dan. So I think, again, you know, full recognition that this differs from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but certainly you're going to want to work closely with whoever is kind of overseeing your electronic laboratory reporting and find out what processes they already have in place, because they may have some of these in place already. But especially, I think, like, I know for us with having laboratories that were already established and sending test results to us, it was really important to make sure that like everyone kind of got the memo that they needed to turn on this additional test result. But beyond that, also to just make sure that we were kind of keeping an eye on overall volume, on making sure that the results we got look the way we expect them to. So I had spent some significant time in years past kind of going through and seeing, okay, if we've got let's say even our antibody test results, it's not just, I think it's not just monitoring your negatives, but making sure that nothing else got shifted in the process. So if my antibody results suddenly start coming back as like 3,000 or less than 500, maybe something went a little wrong. But also make sure that, if you're getting positives from these institutions, you should be getting negatives as well. I think that's the very basic first thing to make sure of. And overall, that you don't drop getting, if you've gotten positives for folks for a while, make sure that you don't suddenly stop getting them, because that can happen in this process too. But I would really say that I think it's important to work with whoever oversees your electronic laboratory reporting, and they may be best able to advise you on the way to do that monitoring.
Thank you. So I'm still not seeing any questions or raised hands, so don't be shy, everyone. But of course, I do have more questions. Could you had mentioned around actions for non-matches, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit more. And then there is a question.
I see that.
Also from Massachusetts. So
thanks, Lindsay. So I think there's this whole, sorry, I'm trying to choose my words. There's this whole debate, I think, that folks may have within their jurisdiction when it comes to capturing especially negative antibodies, but really any of these negative results, right? That from ethics surveillance standpoint, I guess, is this something that is this kind of the minimum necessary requirements for us to be able to say what's going on with hepatitis? And I think even with a negative RNA, which is a test that you wouldn't typically expect is being run unless somebody has some indication of hepatitis C, right? We're going to talk about hepatitis C negative RNA. I know that when we went live with getting negative RNAs, we had individuals who that was the only test result we got, right? So the question is, and this is a question I think each jurisdiction needs to answer for themselves, what do you do with that? Do you assume that there is a missing antibody test? There might be. It might not be from the same lab or the same provider's office. Is this an issue in your deduplication process? Is that something you want to check out? Do you want to hold on to those, or are they events you want to purge from your system? And I don't know that there is one right answer. I think it's something that with capturing negatives, though, that each jurisdiction really needs to think through in terms of what's the minimum information that we should be holding on to. And I think that is really why we get into this question of a separate holding area when we're talking about the negative antibody results. I think there are, I could easily make an argument on either side of this. I think there are benefits for us being able to get some sense of volume of testing, uptake of testing requirements, but there are other data sets we can do that through too. Maybe not as readily as our surveillance system, but there are other ways we could get at some of that information. And so, but seroconversion and identifying acute cases is so challenging, and I think so important when we're talking about acute case investigation. Um, and so having a repository for those negatives that we can query back to when we get a positive and identify those seroconversions is really useful. The question is, how long do you hold on to those negatives? And what do you do with them in the interim? Do you capture any information, or is it really a black box that the only thing that's querying it is your surveillance system, that no other person has any sort of access to that information? I'm seeing questions come up in the chat, so I want to take a look and.
Sure. Well, the first question from Lindsay in Massachusetts, more of a comment. I think Lindsay very correctly points out that it's a lot easier to make the case for the necessity of negative lab reporting for hepatitis C RNA and antibody versus HBV DNA. And I can say for folks who are aware that we are in the process of revising the hepatitis B position statement for both acute and chronic hepatitis B. And the case classifications as currently drafted do not employ negative HBV DNA as part of the case classification. So that will continue to be the case. And so I think that is true, that we don't have a standardized methodology for determining hepatitis B care cascades at this time. But I know that's something that's of great interest and something that is really important for us to try to figure out some ways to capture that information and understand our data better. So I think there's going to be more work in the hepatitis B surveillance space. I think there's been a lot of focus in the last number of years on hepatitis C, and I know a lot of the elimination efforts are really focused on hepatitis C. But we don't want to lose track of hepatitis B and how important it is. So I think there's going to be more to come on that. And I'm happy to answer any questions about that as well.
And I saw somebody say, sorry, this is not a question, just an opinion. Love that. That's incredibly helpful. And, you know, this should be an open forum to share those kind of opinions rather than questions.
And sort of a follow-up to that Lindsay just put in, that she's also requesting a change in our regulations so we can get negative hepatitis D as a Delta test results. So that could be an important part of the hepatitis B care cascade as well, or at least better understanding of each individual case of hepatitis B, if we're looking at that analytically. I think that's a great point. Thanks, Lindsay.
Very, very helpful. And I love this comment about the internal auditing. Yeah, sometimes the data can go missing before it's sent to the surveillance system. I think that's, I am a big proponent of doing kind of regular auditing of all the lab results you're getting and seeing what do those look like? Has there been a volume change from different labs in a way you would expect or you wouldn't expect? I mean, we've had situations, even just in kind of the regular course of the year without making any changes to requirements, right? Where suddenly we stop getting test results on something because they've made a change to their system where it used to be POS for positive, and now they're writing out positive as the result, and the coding for electronic laboratory reporting didn't get changed. So I think doing any sort of auditing of what you're actually getting before you make changes or kind of during the process of things, I think is very helpful. Sorry, I'm going to be on mute for just a second.
Sure. Any other questions or comments? I'd be interested in hearing from jurisdictions that are in the process of maybe changing their regulations, if they have questions or things that have been challenging for them in their jurisdictions. And there's just a comment in here from Adam in Michigan that their data quality monitoring procedures have intensified considerably since receiving negative RNAs. Yeah, no, I think your volume really shifts and ramps up. So that's really helpful. And there's a comment from Kaylin that they started getting none for some negative RNA results, so they have to change things internally to catch them. Yeah, so those are the exact changes you're talking about, Shauna. Yeah, I think that's very common, and it is, you know, there's always these little tricky things that happen with labs that just need to be corrected. It's a really, I think there's this idea that electronic lab reporting solves your problems, and it solves a lot of problems, but it also creates new ones that need to be addressed.
The other thing we didn't talk about, but is, you know, I tried to kind of touch on this very briefly. In terms of thinking about how you're going to implement these, like what you're going to do with these results, I think anything you can do to kind of set up some electronic processes that help triage, help identify cases where you've got negatives, where maybe it's going to change how you're defining a case. If you can test some of that ahead of time, it's very helpful. Even if you can do kind of a trial run with like getting results from 1 or 2 labs and seeing what those really look like in real life, it can be very helpful.
So there's a question from Isabel for Adam, or I would say for anyone who's doing this. What is the staffing that is required to stay on top of that quality control with electronic lab reports?
I mean, I can say that I know for Massachusetts that our surveillance staff has grown considerably, in part because we're doing this, right? We have a system that captures most of our, all of our infectious diseases in one system. So, but in the past, we've done some of that auditing ourselves, and then kind of shared the process so that it could be applied to other things. But it looks like Adam says they currently have 3 viral hep epis that share responsibility for auditing. And right, the folks who oversee your surveillance system are going to be necessary partners in this process.
Absolutely. And there's a comment from Adam in response to Isabel's question that they currently have 3 hep epis that share responsibilities for auditing. And then a question from Leilani that with reporting of HCV negative results, have you seen an increase in detection of seroconversions? And I think that's a question for anyone.
Yeah, I know that we did when we brought it on in Massachusetts. You know, figuring out how to define those took a little bit of the legwork at the beginning, I would say, looking at timing and because remember, you could get a negative and then a positive and then another negative too, right? So trying to create and utilizing the case definition very carefully, I think, to define how you're going to identify those seroconversions is really important. But yeah, we were able to set up some, and I say the royal we, it's not me, it's 100% the folks in our surveillance program were able to set up some kind of automated processes to flag those cases so we could review them more quickly.
Anyone else with experience, especially, so I know in Massachusetts, we have changed our regulations to allow for negative EIA results, but we have not actually started that surveillance process. So it would be, I know that for some jurisdictions where those results, negative results for EIAs, is reportable, that they do detect a majority of their seroconversions through those lab results, but I'd love to hear from someone's experience about that. Okay.
Go ahead, Dan.
Look, there's a question from Rachel here about the balance between asking the higher up data in ELR people to do data QA versus what HepTACs do at the program level. And a lot of the high level people, at least in California, seem to be largely COVID focused and not so helpful with this work.
I would say that, I mean, even pre-COVID, some of it was a little opaque to me too, you know, and I think sometimes our ELR folks were rightfully so, but kind of focus more on the big picture, like overall volume of labs coming in from different sources. And so we have a well-established relationship and we were able to set it up. So I was like, I'm just going to look at data from like the last 3 months, see what we've got and see what looks right and what doesn't look right and where I've got questions, and fully recognizing that they could be real issues or they could just be artifacts. But I think having some of that programmatic expectations about what maybe should be coming through is really helpful in designing some sort of auditing process. And so we started that process, but I would say that once we had results, and this is not going to be the same in all jurisdictions, but like our ELR folks really took it upon themselves to then follow up on those and get us some answers as to what was going on. So we needed to do a little bit of the maybe initial identifying of issues, and then they ran with it.
Great. There's a question here around what are some ways to go about reaching all of the different labs, lab facilities that report to them and make sure that they're aware of reporting HCV negatives and what the regulations are.
So I would say, again, this is a place where whoever oversees your electronic laboratory reporting should be really helpful, right? They should have contact with all of those individuals. And so they may know the best way to go about doing that. I think if you've got a state lab, that's another way that sometimes they have contact with other laboratories and may have a communication channel that they utilize. So that's another way to reach out to laboratory facilities. We had a subset list of folks that did a specific types of reporting for us that we had used to actually do some surveying in the past to say, like, hey, are you doing RNA testing in-house? Should we be getting these results from you? So again, I think it's some of those making additional connections to either your lab or to your surveillance kind of oversight to see what connections they already have established.
Yeah, and I think also there are times when other parts of your department may be sending out like surveys to the clinical labs in your jurisdiction. And so that would be ask questions and find out who may be doing that and seeing if you can tag along and ask some questions as part of that, so that you're not having to take that lead yourselves. And there's a question here. Has anyone had experience storing HCV RNA negatives outside of the surveillance system and managing the care cascade? There's a response here that Kentucky stores negatives and NEDs, but they clean and create care cascade outside of that using REDCap and SAS.
I would say, Massachusetts also stores our negatives in Maven for RNA, and then in the past we've pulled that data out in order to create the care cascade, and done that in SAS, which is, you know, a challenge. In some ways it might be, I don't want to say easier, you're going to have to go through data matching and deduplication in order to do it, if you store them outside, right? But you don't have to go through that process, I guess, of pulling it out of your surveillance system.
Okay, and a comment from Alan about the question about how to communicate rule changes for health systems. Sometimes the infection preventionist is the person who knows about the reporting requirements, so that may help. And certainly like communication with infection preventionists can be very
Laboratory
helpful.
directors, yeah, I think that both of those can be really helpful in getting information out about reporting requirements. And I would say oftentimes if your jurisdiction has a standard process, then there's like regular communications that go out.
And question from Isabel, are there best practices for using the black box for negatives? This is for Claire and anyone else who has experience with this. So Adam, I know you just put a comment in, but I don't know if you want to respond to that. More for what Michigan is doing.
It does sound like there's, for most places that use a black box, there's some sort of regular daily or regular automated process for matching and deduplication to try and pull information out. And I think, like with everything else, deduplication is always a part of the challenge, right?
And a question for Adam around what they use for automated deduplication in Michigan. So other questions or
Hey, Dan, sorry,
experiences
I thought maybe I'd just,
Oh, go ahead.
can you hear me? I thought maybe
Yes.
I'd just call in rather than try to type it. I kept getting behind that responding. So Michigan's black box, like we call it a lab holding area, but it's the same gist. We store results for a calendar year. If they have not matched to a case within our surveillance system, they're then purged. But as far as care cascade data, we kind of have to ping our surveillance system vendor to export separate data sets for us, and we combine those with data directly from our surveillance system, you know, so then we can calculate number of persons screened, initial RNA results, and so forth. I think that answers one of the questions. I feel like I was going to say something else.
So Adam, you
I
get
got
some
it in the chat.
information about volume, but not anything about like the demographics of the folks represented by that volume of tests.
We do get some.
Okay.
It's kind of dependent on the reporting labs. Early on, the data sets that we had requested from our vendor for our black box area did not include demographic data. But I think since early 2021-ish, we started to get more data because they became aware we were interested in you know, running some analysis on these negative results for the people being screened, and then negative RNA tests. So we wouldn't see those people in our surveillance system, but we wanted to know kind of what the population was that we were working with.
And there's a question here for you about what you use for automated deduplication.
Yeah, that's the question I was going to answer and it slipped my mind. So since our surveillance system is kind of homegrown, those algorithms are kind of also homegrown and just built in to our system. Basically, it's like a fuzzy match type of deduplication that outputs a match score. There's a threshold where they automatically match to an existing case, but there's also a gray area where it will kick results into a section of our surveillance system that we manually review to decide whether to merge labs with cases and so on. And then below that threshold, obviously, the results will stay in the black box area until matched to a case or their year expires.
And I thought somebody had their hand up.
Yeah, I think Claire had her hand up. I don't know if you still wanted to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to just chime in briefly for Kentucky. We have our informatics NEDS team. They kind of do a lot of work in our NEDS system for Kentucky in making sure there are certain workflow decisions in place for our negative results and positive results to the best that can be done to open case investigations and go into patient profiles. On the viral hepatitis program, where I am as an epi, we are able to get large text file extracts with all of the lab data from the back end of NEDS. And that has actually worked very well for us. We have to do a lot of the cleaning. We're starting to implement using Match Pro to clean up that deduplication, those issues that arise with duplicate profiles and merging and that nature. But yeah, for us specifically, there's kind of some nice things that happen within NEDS that I don't necessarily have the best perspective on. I hear all the good things, but I'm not intimately involved with that work. But then we are able to get those positive RNA hepatitis labs and negative RNA hepatitis labs out of the back end. But then once we receive those, that does not interface with NEDS again. So if we find issues, we have to manually address that with our lab surveillance team, which has occurred. But I just wanted to give that insight from Kentucky.
I think a lot of places have found like various workarounds for most of our surveillance systems aren't really set up for like analyzing longer term or very long-term illnesses. And so those kind of workarounds, I think, are what a lot of folks are working with.
Any other questions or comments or experiences with this that people wanted to share?
And I will make sure.
Oh, Alan?
Yeah, go ahead, Alan.
It took me a while to unmute myself, but I learned how to do that eventually. And Shauna, don't let me keep you from saying what you were about to say.
Oh, all I was going to say was I'll make sure that Zakea puts my contact information out for folks to be able to reach out to. And Dan certainly knows how to get a hold of me too. Just if folks have particular thoughts about what would be useful, I would love to hear that. Go ahead, Alan.
One thing that I can say, do as I say, not as I do, because Arkansas learned this the hard way, is, I really wish that when we started doing this, we had provided clear guidance to laboratories as to what is a positive and what is a negative, and how do we expect you to send that to us. We never did that, and so some of them were like, well, we're going to use this official SNOMED code. Some of them were like, we don't like standard codes at all. We don't care about that. Some of them were like, we're going to write a novel in the results field. And related to that, if anyone has done a good job of figuring out how to resolve that in their jurisdiction, I think that would be really wonderful to hear, certainly for us. And I don't know how many jurisdictions have that problem, but we would definitely be interested in knowing about other people's good practices for that.
Are you talking specifically about the negative RNAs and some of like the numeric values?
I mean, that's where it causes a lot of the
Yeah.
problems, because you get a huge volume and then you get, tests that have an unclear distinction between, is this number a log or is this number just a number? Because I'm going to interpret it differently depending on that. Then, there are things where it's like, how many ways can you misspell negative? And the answer is quite a lot.
Quite a few. I hear you on that. Yeah.
And so, I mean, that it does definitely apply to that, but just broadly, anybody who has who has been able to keep that problem under control in their jurisdiction, I think that would definitely be of interest to a lot of us. I can't speak for other states, but it would definitely be good to know for us.
Any other questions or comments?
Oh, sorry, this is Claire with Kentucky again.
Please.
I did want to address Alan, I think it was Alan's comment regarding kind of the messy lab results. We always get to what we think is a finishing spot, and then more work needs to be done. So what we have available, I'm definitely happy to share. It's not as straightforward as I think anyone would like that work to be, but it is as clear cut as we've been able to get it. And then other people that I have talked to, they have just limited what they consider to be usable labs. So we're trying not to go that route, trying to keep the net very wide. But that is also something we've looked at as well, trying to focus in on what we know is very accurate and not maybe over concerned with the very dirty data we don't know exactly how to handle.
So that's something we can also make sure is covered in this tip sheet.
And Alan said that that he would be interested in seeing any code or documentation that Kentucky has. So
We can help to connect you guys.
Yeah, for sure. It's rough. So
excellent. So I see we are near the top of the hour. So Zakia just put on her video, so I'm assuming she's going to jump in to make the final announcements. But I just want to thank Shauna for her presentation and for answering all these questions, and then also all of you for your participation today. It's always really great to have a chance to talk about viral hepatitis surveillance with you all. I'll turn this back to Zakia.
Yes. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Shauna, and thank you all for coming today and sharing and letting us know what are some of the things you all are working on and things that you all need assistance with. I do want to remind you all that we will have office hours on May 17th at 3 p.m. Eastern. So feel free to continue bringing your questions. Any super specific questions or things that you all are working on and you want to get some feedback from peers, definitely feel free to bring on the 17th. I don't know, we're all nerds here, so we'll figure it out. So thank you all. And I did want to mention, we also have our VLC survey that is in the chat. If you all can please fill it out and give us some really honest feedback about how you all have been liking these sessions and what things we can do to improve or continue doing for our next iteration of the VLC. It can be not nice in response.
Yeah, it can be tough. We need that too.
Yes. But yeah, so the survey will close on May 12th. So please let us know what you all would like to see. So thank you all again. Thank you again, Don and Shauna. Dan and Shauna. Thank you all. And yeah, y'all have a good rest of your afternoon. So thank you so much.
And
Bye.
thank you to our friends at NASTAD for creating this opportunity for this discussion. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.